Starting with the treatment of traumatic brain injury part, infants and children with a severe and moderate TBI, that is GCS score of 3 to 8 for severe and 9 to 12 for moderate, receive intensive care unit monitoring. We have to keep those in ICU. Evidence-based guidelines for the management of the severe traumatic brain injury have been published. This approach to ICP directed therapy is also reasonable for other conditions in which ICP is monitored. Care involves a multidisciplinary team comprising pediatric caregivers from the neurologic surgery, critical care medicine, surgery, and rehabilitation, among other services, and is directed at preventing secondary insults and managing raised ICPs. Fine. So we have to basically prevent the secondary insults and manage the race ICP. Initial stabilization of infants and children with the severe traumatic brain injury includes rapid sequence tracheal intubation with spine precautions. So what we'd have to do in initial stabilization for infants and children with severe traumatic brain injury is we have to do rapid sequence tracheal intubation with what? Spine precautions along with the maintenance of the normal extracerebral hemodynamics. So in severe traumatic brain injury, we have to intubate the patient and we have to do spine precautions along with that we have to maintain the normal extracerebral hemodynamics, including the blood gas values, mean arterial pressure, and temperature. We have to do intravenous fluid boluses may be required to treat the hypotension. Firstly, we did the intubation, then we can give IV fluid boluses to treat what? Hypotension. Euvolemia is the target and hypotonic fluids must be rigorously avoided. We have to avoid the hypotonic fluids, right? Because we have to, the target is euvolemia. Normal saline is the fluid of choice. What needs to be given if we are starting the bolus in case of hypotension, we have to start with a normal saline. Pressors may be needed as guided by the monitoring of the central venous pressure with avoidance of both the fluid overload and exacerbation of the brain edema. We might need vasopressors, but we have to avoid both the fluid overload and exacerbation of the brain edema also. A trauma survey should be performed. Once stabilized, the patient should be taken for CT scan to rule out the need for. So after stabilization, we have to take for CT. Why we have to take for CT? To rule out the need for emergency neurosurgical intervention. Fine. We have to do this to rule out need for emergency neurosurgical intervention. If the surgery is not required, an ICP monitor should be inserted to guide the treatment of intracranial hypertension. Okay, so if surgery is not being done, we should do an ICP monitor should be inserted to guide the treatment for intracranial hypertension. Repeat the CT. Repeat CT may help determine whether a new lesion requiring surgical intervention has developed. This should be obtained if there is change in examination or for refractory intracranial hypertension. So what is written here is when do we need repeat CT and what will it help with? Repeat CT will help us to see if there is a new lesion which require a surgical intervention. Fine, and this should be obtained if there is change in examination. If we see any change in examination, then we have to do repeat CT or refractory intracranial or for refractory intracranial hypertension. Fine. During stabilization or at any time during the treatment course, patient can present with signs and symptoms of cerebral herniation. So these are the signs of cerebral herniation, that is pupillary dilation, systemic hypertension, bradycardia, extensor posturing. We have to remember the signs of cerebral herniation, that is pupillary dilation, systemic hypertension, bradycardia, and extensor posturing. Because herniation and its devastating consequences can sometimes be reversed if promptly addressed, it should be treated as a medical emergency. With use of hyperventilation with a fraction of inspired oxygen of 1 titrated to reversal of pupillary dilation. What is written here is because uh, it is it can be reversed, so we have to treat it as an emergency. With what? It is a medical emergency because it is reversible. We can prevent it. We can save the patient with the use of what? Hyperventilation with use of hyperventilation with a fraction of inspired oxygen of 1 titrated to a reversal of pupillary dilation, and administration of either hypertonic saline or mannitol. This can be done. We can either administer hypertonic saline of 3% solution, 5 to 10 ml per kg, or mannitol. This is how we will manage the cerebral herniation. Hypertonic saline of 3%, we have to remember this, right? 5 to 10 ml per kg. Or mannitol, this rate is 0.25 to 1 gram per kg IV. If an external ventricular drain in place, it should be open to continuous drainage. Pentobarbital administration can also be considered if prompt clinical response has not been observed. We can also use pentobarbital if clinical response has not been observed. ICP should be maintained at less than 20 mm of Hg. Age dependent cerebral perfusion CPP. Wait, is cerebral perfusion pressure. So we have to maintain the ICP. This is important. We have to maintain ICP at less than 20 mm of Hg, and there is age dependent CPP targets are approximately 50 mm of Hg for children 2 to 6 years of age, 55 mm of Hg for those 7 to 10 years of age, and 65 mm of Hg for 11 to 16 years of the age. Fine, this is the ICP was different and cerebral perfusion pressure targets are different. Fine. First tier therapy includes elevation of the head of the bed, ensuring midline positioning of the head, controlled mechanical ventilation, and analgesia and sedation. What is done is these are the first year therapy. These are the things included in the first year therapy. What is included? First is elevation of head of the bed, ensuring a midline position of the head and controlled mechanical ventilation, like we intubated, and analgesia and sedation. Sedation by narcotics and benzodiazepines. If the neuromuscular blockade is needed, it may be desirable to monitor the EEG continuously because status epilepticus can occur. Fine, we have to monitor EEG if neuromuscular blockade is needed. Because why? Because status epilepticus can occur. This complication will not be recognized in a paralyzed patient and is associated with raised ICP and unfavorable outcome. So if a patient is paralyzed, no, this this complication, the status epilepticus will not be recognized in that patient, and it comes with an unfavorable outcome. If a ventricular rather than parenchymal catheter is used to monitor the ICP, therapeutic CSF drainage is available and can provide either continuously or intermittently in response to ICP spikes. So it is written here that we should use ventricular catheter rather than a parenchymal catheter. What needs to be preferred is a ventricular catheter. Why? To use catheter. Why we were using catheter to monitor the ICP, and why we have to use ventricular catheter because it is therapeutic. Also, we can do therapeutic CSF drainage, and like we can manage the ICP by draining it further. Fine. Moving ahead, or intermittently in response to ICP spikes, generally more than 20 mm of Hg. Other first tier therapies include the osmolar agents. These are also first line therapies. Fine. So we should continue this numbering. What the first line agents we read about? Elevation of the head, midline positioning was also included, controlled mechanical ventilation, analgesia, and sedation. Now, the first line that we are going to read about are Osmolar agents, hypertonic saline or the mannitol. I think this will be fifth. Bolus administration of 3% hypertonic saline between 2 and 5 ml per kg over 10 to 20 minutes has guideline based levels. 2. Evidence supporting it is used to treat the ICP spikes more than 20 mm of Hg or using a fixed dosing interval. It can also be given as a continuous infusion of 3% saline at zero point 0.1 to 1 ml per kg per hour. So this is these are the osmolar agents that we are using. What we are using initially, we can use either hypertonic saline or mannitol. And how we have to use hypertonic saline, we can either give a bolus administration or we can also use continuous infusion also. Fine. So how is bolus administration of hypertonic 3% hypertonic saline done? We have to give 2 to 5 ml per kg over 10 to 20 minutes. This needs to be remembered. And this is used to treat the ICP spikes of more than 20 mm of Hg or using a fixed 4 to 6 hour dosing interval. Fine, we can either give bolus and we can use 4 to 6 hourly dosing interval, and it can also be given as an infusion also. How the infusion can be set up at zero point 0.1 to 1 ml per kg. Fine. This was all about hypertonic saline. Now let's read about the mannitol. We have to start with 0.25 to 1 gram per kg IV over 20 minutes represents as an alternative. These agents can be used concurrently. It is recommended to avoid serum osmolality of more than 320 milliosmol per liter. A Foley's urinary catheter should be placed to monitor the urine output. Okay, so we have to place a Foley's also. And if increased ICP remains refractory to treatment, careful reassessment of the patient is needed to rule out unrecognized hypercarbia. What is written? If there is increased ICP, even after giving treatment, so we have to rule out what? First is the unrecognized hypercarbia, then hypoxemia, fever, hypotension, hypoglycemia, pain, and seizures. These things need to be ruled out. What needs to be ruled out? Unrecognized hypercarbia, hypoxemia, fever, hypotension, hypoglycemia, pain, and seizures. Repeat imaging should be considered to rule out a surgical lesion. Guideline based second tier therapies for the refractory ICPs are available, but evidence for favoring a second line therapy is limited. So there are second tier therapies. Let's see if it's written or not. These tables will be discussed in this video only. Fine. First, let's read about it, then we will discuss these tables. In some centers, decompressive craniectomy is used. Okay, so there was increased ICP, so we can also use decompressive craniectomy. Others use a pentobarbital infusion with a loading dose of 5 to 10 mg per kg over 30 minutes, followed by 5 mg per kg every hour for 3 doses, and then a maintenance with an infusion of 1 mg per kg. I think this is also being done for decompression. We can give pentobarbital. I've never seen this. But how can we use? We have to give first a loading dose of 5 to 10 ml per kg over 30 minutes, followed by, this was the loading dose. Then after loading dose, we have to start with 5 mg per kg every hour for 3 doses. And then a maintenance with an infusion of 1 mg per kg. This is how we are decompressing. Careful blood pressure monitoring is required because of possibility of the drug-induced hypotension and the frequent need for support with the fluids or pressors. So we have to monitor the blood pressure very carefully because there can be drug-induced hypotension, and so there will be frequent need for support with the fluids or the pressors. Mild hypothermia to control the refractory ICP is controversial but can be induced and maintained by means of surface cooling. So, mild hypothermia can also be used. Mild hypothermia is between 32 to 34 degrees centigrade. Why is it being used to control the refractory ICP? It is controversial but can be induced by maintaining what? Surface cooling. Sedation and neuromuscular blockades are used to prevent shivering, and rewarming should be slow. Hypotension should be prevented during the rewarming. Refractory raised ICP can also be treated with hyperventilation. How can also We can also try hyperventilation for refractory raised ICP. Combinations of these second tier therapies are often required. These were all the second tier therapies. Oh, after this, fine. These are all the second tier therapies. So, what we read in the second tier therapies: craniectomy, pentobarbital infusion, and hypothermia and hyperventilation. These were all the second tier. Now, the supportive care. Euvolemia should be maintained and isotonic fluids are recommended throughout the ICU stay. Fine. We have to maintain the isotonic fluid and we have to maintain euvolemia. Either SIADH or CSW can develop and are important to differentiate because management of the SIADH is fluid restriction and that of the CSW is the sodium replacement. So we have to differentiate between them and we have to manage them differently. How we manage SIADH is by fluid restriction and that the CSW is by the sodium replacement. Severe hyperglycemia, that is blood glucose of more than 200 mg per dl, should be avoided and treated. The blood glucose level should be monitored frequently. Early nutrition with the enteral feeding is advocated. We have to monitor blood glucose frequently and we have to start early nutrition with the enteral feed. Fine. Corticosteroids should generally not be used unless adrenal insufficiency is documented. Tracheal suctioning can exacerbate the raised ICP. So this don't we don't have to do tracheal suctioning because it can exacerbate the raised ICP. So it is not to be done. Timing of the use of analgesics or sedatives around the suctioning events and or use of tracheal or IV lidocaine can be helpful. Moving ahead, seizures are common after severe acute traumatic brain injury. So there is early post-traumatic seizure within 1 week will complicate management of the TBI and are often difficult to treat. These are called early post-traumatic seizure if they occur within 1 week. Anticonvulsant prophylaxis with the fosphenytoin or the levetiracetam is recommended. Okay, so in supportive care, we have to give an anticonvulsant prophylaxis with what? Fosphenytoin or levetiracetam. This needs to be done. Late post-traumatic seizure after 7 days, when we call it post-traumatic, if it occurs after 7 days of traumatic brain injury, and if recurrent, late post-traumatic epilepsy are not prevented by prophylactic anticonvulsants, whereas early post-traumatic seizures are prevented by initiating anticonvulsants. So if we are initiating anticonvulsants, we will only be able to prevent early post-traumatic seizures. Antifibrinolytic agents reduce the hemorrhage size as well as the development of new focal ischemic cerebral lesion, and improve the survival in adults with severe traumatic brain injury. Okay, so we can start with antifibrinolytic agents. It improves the survival in adults. How it Antifibrinolytic agents example is the tranexamic acid. How is it improving the survival? By reducing the hemorrhage size as well as the development of new focal ischemic cerebral lesions. Fine. How is antifibrinolytic agent acting? By reducing the hemorrhage size and by preventing the development of new focal cerebral ischemic lesions. Now the prognosis. Mortality rates for children with the severe traumatic brain injury who reach the pediatric ICU range between 10 to 30%, and that is really high. Ability to control the ICP is related to patient survival, and the extent of cranial and systemic injuries correlates with the quality of life. Motor and cognitive sequelae resulting from the severe traumatic brain injury generally benefit from rehabilitation to minimize long-term disabilities. Recovery from traumatic brain injury may take months or years to achieve. Physical therapy and in some centers, methylphenidate or amantadine helps with the motor and behavioral recovery. Fine, so methylphenidate and amantadine may also be used for motor and behavioral recovery. Pituitary insufficiency may be uncommon but significant complication of severe traumatic brain injury. As a complication of severe traumatic brain injury, even pituitary insufficiency can occur, but it's uncommon. So this was all about traumatic brain injury. Wait, we have to discuss this also. Let's start by looking at the images which are given here. There's a skull fracture here. There is a mildly displaced skull fracture seen on the CT. CT imaging in a 4-year-old who fell and hit her head on the curb. In this CT, there is an epidural hematoma. See, the left frontal and also on the CT, the left side of the image is basically the left side of the right side of the patient. So this is the right side of the patient. So there is an epidural hematoma, left frontal epidural hematoma, because on this side, this is the left frontal hematoma observed on the CT imaging in a 12-year-old who fell off his bike on a concrete surface. In this image, it shows subdural hematoma, left subdural hematoma observed on the CT imaging in a 10-year-old child after a motor vehicle accident. Note the effacement of the lateral ventricle. That is, there is compression of the lateral ventricle which is seen, right? And there is a midline shift also. See, we can see the midline shift in this. And this is the subdural hematoma, hyperacute right frontal subdural hematoma observed on the CT in a 5-year-old after a motor vehicle accident. Note the hyperacute aspect of the subdural hematoma is dark. This line is important. We should focus on this. That hyperacute aspect of the subdural hematoma is dark on the CT imaging in the early stage after injury. Also note there is a marked midline shift of the intracranial contents. We can appreciate the midline shift, right? As both the lateral ventricles are displaced onto the left side of the skull. Fine. So this line that we talked about earlier, that in hyperacute hemorrhage, that is in the very early stage of the bleeding, there is the blood appears darker. I mean, not darker. It's not white as we as we what expect it to be. Okay. So if we all know that if we suspect a hemorrhage on CT, it will appear white, like here also, right? We discussed this is white in color, but if the hemorrhage is very recent, very early bleed, hyperacute, it doesn't appear white. Why? Because the freshly leaked blood is mostly liquid and it is mixed with the plasma and it is not fully clotted, no. So its density is near normal to the brain tissue. That's why it is very hard to appreciate it here. So it appears hyperacute subdural hematoma appears dark gray or isodense or only slightly bright. But what happens later that it appears white is blood clot, blood blood clotting starts. Right, there is fibrin mesh formation, and the RBCs are packed together, and the plasma is squeezed out of it. So now there is higher concentration of the hemoglobin in cells and less water proportion, and that makes the hematoma denser on the CT. That's why we see a bright white or hyperdense on acute hemorrhages. Okay. Let's look at few more images. This is this image. These both two show subdural hematoma, a 3-month-old child who suffered from the abusive head trauma. In the initial CT imaging, we can see the subdural hematoma. Right? See, this is the hematoma just beneath the dura. So that's subdural hematoma. And in this image, these are the anterior horns of the lateral ventricle. This is the third ventricle, and this it will be seen something like this, right? This is, oh, not like this, like this, something like this. This will be the posterior horn of the lateral ventricle. So in this image we saw this subdural hematoma, and in the image B the subdural hematomas are slightly larger, but the infarctions are noted in the posterior areas of the brain parenchyma. We can appreciate that the subdural hematomas have increased and there is color change in the posterior part indicating infarctions. Now in this image, there is hemorrhage and edema in a 16-year-old who fell from dirt bike. CT imaging demonstrates intraparenchymal hemorrhage. See, we can see the intraparenchymal hemorrhage, which is white in color, and significant surrounding edema. We can also notice the edema also. Fine. In this image, there is skull fractures and hemorrhage. We can see the right. See, this is the comminuted skull fractures. An 11-year-old child was hit in the head by a horse, and CT imaging demonstrates multiple comminuted skull fractures with the fragments of the bone within the brain parenchyma, multifocal areas of intraparenchymal hemorrhage. See, there are multiple multifocal areas of intraparenchymal hemorrhage and obliteration of the left lateral ventricle. See, this side lateral ventricle is not visible only because it is obliterated. Okay. In this image, we can see the hemorrhages and the axonal injuries. In a 6-year-old child who was hit by a car while riding his bike, initial CT demonstrates no obvious abnormality. In this CT image, we can not see any abnormality, but this is an MRI. However, immediate MRI demonstrates multiple areas of the punctate hemorrhages consistent with the diffuse axonal injury, which is a very severe type of injury. This multiple punctate hemorrhages that we see is seen in the immediate CT, but there were no immediate changes in the MRI. Okay, so now looking at this flow chart, in this algorithm for the head CT scan using predictive rules, GCS, and loss of consciousness. On the basis of this, we have to decide that when the CT is recommended and when CT is not. Starting with, it is divided into two groups: in less than 2 years and in more than 2 years. Okay, so this is divided on the basis of age first, less than 2 years and more than 2 years. In less than 2 years, if there is low GCS score of less than or equal to 14, there are signs of altered mental status, and there is a palpable skull fracture, then we have to do CT. Okay. But if there is just scalp hematoma, there is loss of consciousness for more than 5 seconds, there is a severe mechanism of injury, and according to parents, the child is not acting normally. Fine. In that case, we have to decide that whether we have to do observation or CT. Fine. And this is based on what? On the physician's experience, on multiple versus isolated findings, and worsening symptoms in the emergency department if the age is less than 3 months, and on the parental preference also. And what is the severe mechanism of injury? That if there is a fall from height, and if there is any vehicle accident, or there are any high impact trauma. So in this case, right, we can either observe or do an CT. But if nothing of this is present, there is no GCS alteration, there is no mental status is normal, there is no skull fracture, there is no hematoma, there was no loss of consciousness, and the mechanism of injury was not severe, and child is acting normally, behaving normally, then the CT is not recommended. Fine. Now, in more than 2 years, CT is recommended when the GCS is less than 14. This things are same. Fine. When the GCS is recommended, when the CT is recommended, when the GCS is less than 14, there is signs of altered mental status, and there are signs of basilar skull fracture. When we will call that there is a signs, what are the signs of basilar skull fracture? It's raccoon eyes, it's CSF leak from the nose or ear, it's battle sign, and hemotympanum. And if these things are present, no, then we have to do CT. But if there is history of loss of consciousness, history of vomiting, severe mechanism of injury, and severe headache, then we have to decide on whether we have to do CT or observation based on, again, physician's experience, multiple versus isolated findings, worsening symptoms in the emergency department, and parental preference. Fine. And if all of these things are not present, then the CT is not recommended. So when the CT is not recommended, when the GCS is 15, when there are no signs of altered mental status, when there is no signs of basilar skull fracture, no history of loss of consciousness, no vomiting, no severe mechanism of injury, and no headache, no severe headache. Fine. The only thing that is left in this video is the discussion about this flow chart, in which we are going to see the traumatic brain injury, management if the GCS is less than 8, and it will require some time. So this will be discussed in next part. Thank you.